Welcome to the Old Ottawa South Garden Club. In this presentation, Master Gardener Rebecca Last will lead us through the basics of seed saving, plant genetics, collection techniques, storage and viability. Marilyn, please introduce our speaker.
Rebecca Last has been gardening on and off since the age of 8. And she's been a member of the Master Gardeners of Ottawa Carleton since 2005. She has a small suburban garden, which is certified by the Canadian Wildlife Federation as wildlife habitat. Rebecca grows a dozen or more varieties of heritage tomatoes every year. So that just gives you a sense of how dedicated a gardener she is. Her garden design includes elements of permaculture, and she's been honored to receive several awards from a number of different groups in the Ontario horticultural community. Rebecca's gardening addiction, she says, is enabled by her loving husband, Richard, and a collection of very spoiled rescue cats. Rebecca has spoken to our club before, and I was talking to someone with another club about the topic, the interest of having someone speak about collecting seeds and storing seeds. And she highly recommended Rebecca because she's so knowledgeable. And in the session that she had speaking at this other club, there were many questions, lots of interest. And so we approached Rebecca, and she's agreed to come back and speak to us about seed saving and storage. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Rebecca. And Rebecca, please, the session is yours.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be back. I have a soft spot for the Old Ottawa South Garden Club because you folks have challenged me a couple of, maybe even 3 times to come up with new presentations, and I really enjoy that challenge. So thank you. Today we're going to be talking about seed saving and storage, and we'll talk about why you might want to save seeds. There are lots of different kinds of seeds you can save and others that you may not want to. Now, if you remember your high school biology, these days it might even be grade school biology, but we'll revisit the work of Gregor Mendel, who was one of the first people to really map genetic traits in plants. And we'll talk about how different plants express their genetic traits. And that, of course, is a very useful thing to understand when you're saving seeds. We'll also talk about seed saving for beginner, experienced, and more expert varieties. There are some kinds of seeds are really easy to save. Others require a little bit more thought and planning. We'll talk about timing your seed collection, collection methods, seed sanitation, storage, long-term seed viability. We'll end with some resources, and as Colin said, we'll take questions as we go through. So why might you want to save seeds? And if this were a live meeting, I'd pause here and let people contribute their ideas. But since that's a little bit more difficult to do on Zoom, we'll just go ahead and say you can save money by saving your own seeds. I regularly spend, I would say, about $100 every year to buy different varieties of seeds, even though I'm saving a lot of my own. But most importantly, you can ensure a supply of varieties that you like by saving your own, because the ones that you can get this year may not be the ones that you can get next year. And a good example of this is the castor bean plant. And for several years, the castor bean plant went off the market because its seeds are highly toxic. They contain a toxin called ricin that was used in some terrorist attacks in Japan. And as a result, right around the world, it became very difficult to find seeds for castor bean plants. And they're plants where the big oily seed actually will only be viable for about 1 year. So if you weren't growing your seeds on and saving them every year, there were probably a few years there where you couldn't buy them. You also get to breed for local adaptation. And my experience with plants that I have had difficulty growing in my garden, because it's a little bit cooler, I grow on the north side of a hill right next to the Ottawa Valley, and or right next to the Ottawa River rather, and while the rest of the city of Ottawa is about zone 5A or maybe even 5B if you're in the Glebe or downtown areas like Old Ottawa South. My garden is very strictly 4B, and so I have to be a little bit careful. But the things that last best and do best in my garden are often the varieties where I've saved the seed and grown them myself. Rare and unusual plants are another reason for growing and saving your own seeds. And of course, that means that you're able to promote biodiversity. I also find there's this wonderful connection with history and culture. And some of my favorite heritage varieties are ones that have this wonderful history behind them. And of course, by growing them out, we preserve those heritage varieties. We can even breed new varieties. For many of you who may have attended recent Seedy Saturday events, you'll know that the number of small-scale vendors at the Seedy Saturdays is continuing to grow. And this is because a lot of the small market farmer growers have taken on a new product line, and they're selling seeds during the winter to, pardon the pun, make some seed money for their planting and growing season. And of course, we can share those seeds with friends and have a lot of fun with children. There's several varieties of dehiscent seeds, and I'll explain that term as we go along, that kids visiting my garden have a lot of fun with. For example, the poppy seed heads, which when they're ripe are a little bit like a salt shaker. But most importantly, I think seed saving is an act of quiet revolution. And that's because as of 2020, there are now 4 companies that control about 60% of the global food and seed market. And you can see these companies here. These are the big ones: Bayer, which recently bought Monsanto, BASF, ChemChina, and Corteva. These are the 4 big companies that control better than 60% of the seeds that are sold in the world. And these are not seed companies. These are chemical companies. And so these are the companies that are putting, coatings on the seed that provide fertilizer or perhaps have some kind of pest control. And they're selling often seeds that are genetically modified or that are hybridized. Their main market is our farmers. And of course, this is where the variety and frankly, the security of our food is becoming, I think, quite dangerously threatened. So as I said, it is an act of quiet revolution to save our own seeds. Well, what kind of seeds do you want to save? Well, you want to save seeds from open pollinated plants. And what that means is plants where nobody has interfered with nature taking its course. There's been no artificial insemination of one plant by another using human control. And there are easy annuals and biennials that we can save. Some examples are cosmos, French marigolds, calendula or the pot marigold, poppies, biennials including lupins, hollyhocks, and sea holly. Vegetables like peas, beans, and lettuce, tomatoes, ground cherries, herbs like basil, chives, garlic chives, dill, anise hyssop, and lavender, and then some perennials like gay feather or the Liatris family, columbines, and Physostegia. Even some of our tree seeds For example, I live quite close to a Manitoba maple. I can tell you, I don't need to save Manitoba maple seedlings. They just pop up all over the place. So they germinate quite quickly. Nut trees can be a little bit more challenging and often require special conditions for saving the seeds. In fact, many of them don't save well at all. That's one of the challenges that we face right now with the butternut tree and the butternut canker, which is destroying it. We haven't yet worked out how to save those big oily butternut seeds. And then you can also have fun by growing exotic and tropical plants from seed, such as oranges, lemons, grapefruits, avocados. Now, the thing is that a lot of these plants, these exotic and tropical plants, will grow very nicely from seed, but as with an apple, you know you can plant those apple seeds and you will get a little apple seedling, and eventually you'll get an apple tree, but the fruit from that apple tree might be quite different from the fruit from the apple that you got the seed from. And that's because there's two parents. In most cases where you want to reproduce a fruit tree or a nut tree, you would do so via grafting. And that ensures that you have a clone and you get exactly the qualities that you were looking for from the original fruit or nut tree. Some of the things that don't save well are hybrid plants because they won't breed true. Now, early in my gardening career, I had this fetish, I guess you could call it, for the big double cream colored marigolds. They're really pretty and they're really showy, and damn, they're expensive to buy. And I thought, well, I should be able to save seed from them. I can save seed from other marigolds. And I did. And after 2 or 3 years, I had these weird hybrid marigold plants that were about 4 feet tall, and they had no petals at all. They just had the stamens and styles and so forth, and no petals. And that's because, unbeknownst to me at the time, those double cream marigolds were actually a hybrid. And so it didn't matter how carefully I saved the seed, it wasn't going to breed true. Winter annuals are another one. And my favorite example here is the forget-me-not, Myostis. And this is a plant that, as you know, it's an early spring flower. It's usually all over and done by middle to the end of May. At that point, it's setting its seed, and its seeds will have germinated and started to produce little seedlings by late summer. So if you know what those look like, you can simply leave those or dig them up and move them wherever you want them. You don't need to start those seeds you don't need to save them and start them from scratch. Some of the other ones that are challenging, the so-called promiscuous veggies, members of the cucurbit family, which have both male and female flowers. And this is everything from acorn squash to zucchini or cantaloupes, winter squash, summer squash. These are all members of the cucurbit family. Cucumbers, also in the same family. I once had, one fall, I top dressed a side raised bed with some compost from my compost bin. And the next spring, I had these 3 or 4 very healthy looking little squash seedlings. And I thought, oh, let's let them go and see what happens. And what happened was that on 3 or 4 plants, I had about 8 different kinds of fruit. And some of them were quite nice. They were a little bit like a zucchini, mild flavored, kind of wet. Others were harder, more like a winter squash. There were a few that were like the bottle gourds that we get at this time of year to decorate our Thanksgiving table, completely inedible, but they looked cute. And what fascinated me was that on one plant, I would have several different varieties. And that's because these are the promiscuous veggies. And that one seed was carrying all kinds of genetic material, and it expressed itself through the flowers and fruit. Prolific self-seeders. Well, morning glories are a great example of that. And my favorite little forget-me-nots, another good example of prolific self-seeders. When we first moved to our home about nearly 30 years ago now, my mom gave me a handful of morning glory seeds. They have this lovely blue trumpet flower that we both loved. And I planted them by the front walkway so they could twine up the railing of the front steps. I have never planted them since, and I've had morning glories every single year. In fact, I'd have to say morning glory seedlings are probably one of the more prolific weeds in my garden. And then there's plants that propagate vegetatively, and members of the mint family, as we all know, are so easy to divide and much easier than to start fresh. And then, of course, you're also getting exactly the qualities that you want, because when you propagate vegetatively through division, you're getting a clone of the original plant. And finally, plants that produce via a bulb or a tuber are a little bit more challenging to start from seed. This isn't always true. In fact, I do quite frequently get little seedlings of Liatris spicata, which is essentially a bulb-based plant. It's a small bulb, but it produces a bulb. And that one seems to produce very, very nicely from the little tufted seeds that waft through the garden, rather like dandelion seeds. Now, I threatened you with Gregor Mandel. Here he is. He was an Augustinian monk who lived in the first half of the 19th century. And for a celibate monk, he spent an awful lot of time thinking about sex. Although, to be fair, he was mostly focused on plant sex. And in particular, what he was interested in were the traits that would be expressed when he saved pea seeds. And this is one of his classic experiments here. He crossed a yellow pea with a green pea, and then he looked to see what happened in the next 3 generations. And what he found from this experiment was that the yellow pea seed was dominant. Now, these expressions of dominant and recessive traits were really not even understood, not even recognized in Mendel's day, because of course we didn't know anything about genetics until, well, about 80 years later, when Crick and Watson discovered the double helix. So Mendel was working strictly on observation, and what he observed from the original cross of one green and one yellow and one green pea was that over 3 generations, there were roughly 3 times as many yellow peas as there were green peas. And so from that, he knew that if he wanted green peas, he would have to work harder and maybe eliminate the yellow ones. And so only the green ones were left. Now, we can make the same kinds of observation in our own gardens. One of the things that I've been growing for probably about 25 years now, using mostly saved seed, are ornamental poppies, annual poppies, Papaver somniferum. These are actually opium poppies, but let's not mention that to anybody. I grow them just because they have this beautiful crepe paper flower. And my observation, having started with a double red poppy, is that is very much a deeply recessive trait, because in 25 years of growing these things, I've probably had, I would say, fewer than a dozen double red poppies. The one I get most frequently is a single lavender, and sometimes I get a double pink. Sometimes I get a single lavender with fringes on it. But that double red is a very unusual characteristic, and one that you really have to work to be able to save seed for. So let's look at some of the dominant and recessive traits in some of the plants that it's easy to save seeds for. So peas are one where it's really easy to save seeds. The pea flower is kind of closed in on itself, and it's self-fertile. So these do tend to grow true as long as you're not growing a hybrid variety of pea. It's in terms of its dominant characteristics, the bush variety is a recessive trait, The tall twining pole bean or pole pea is the dominant one. Wrinkled seeds are recessive. The round seed is dominant. And this is where we come to understand a little bit more about what's gone into the historical breeding of things. Because of course we like our pods to have fewer fibers. In fact, I typically will grow only the sugar snap or snow pea varieties because I like to actually be able to eat the pods. Well, it turns out that lack of fibers inside the pod is a recessive trait. And in terms of the pod shape, that snow pea that I like to grow, which has a flat pod, that's a recessive trait as well. So clearly somebody somewhere down the line did a lot of work to breed the fiber-free pods that were flat to make the snow peas. In terms of beans, you see the same growth habit characteristics. The pole beans are dominant, bush beans are recessive. So if you're saving seeds from a bush bean, make sure there's no pole beans anywhere close. This is one of the main messages here. Again, the stringless trait and the little lack of fiber in the pod, making the pod edible. These are recessive traits. And interestingly enough, the colored seeds are the dominant ones, whereas a white bean is a recessive trait. In terms of lettuce, red color is dominant. Although their leaf color is controlled by several different genes, the red leaf gene color is the one that's dominant. Leaves that are not lobed are dominant, as opposed to the oak leaf type of lettuce where you have lobes on the leaf. That's a recessive trait. Bolt resistance is a recessive trait. Black seeds are dominant and white seeds are recessive. And just a word about saving your lettuce seeds. I know that most of us will tend to want to eat our lettuce, and once it starts to bolt, we just rip it out of the ground. But the first one that bolts is not the one that you should save. What you should be saving seeds from are the very last lettuces to bolt in your garden, because those are the ones that have the most heat resistance. And by saving the seeds from the last lettuce to bolt, you're slowly going to be building in that trait of bolt resistance that we talked about being a recessive trait. If you're saving pepper seeds, just be aware that the spiciness, the high concentrations of capsicum, which is the spice, it's the compound that gives the heat to peppers, that is dominant. So if you're looking to save seeds from a sweet, mild pepper, make sure it's not planted near a hot one. Now, tomatoes, we know a lot about tomato genetics because it is the single best-selling vegetable and most used vegetable in North America, I think maybe even globally. So indeterminate varieties are the dominant trait. The determinate or bush varieties or dwarf varieties that we grow in containers, that's a recessive trait. Some of you may have grown heritage varieties of tomatoes that have a potato leaf, and that's a recessive trait. Now, I have to say, having grown many, many tomatoes over many years, my experience is that the potato leaf type fruits tend to be a little pickier to grow. And if I were going to breed my own tomato, the leaf type is not something that I would necessarily be selecting for. There's a recessive trait that prevents green shoulders in tomatoes. And the long keeper varieties, which are the ones that we tend to buy in the winter because they ship well, because they tend not to ripen so fast, that is also a recessive trait. A leaf mold resistance is a recessive trait. Fusarium wilt resistance is actually a dominant trait, as is resistance to verticillium, alternaria, tobacco mosaic virus, and nematodes. So that's actually really good news. Tomatoes are a plant that has been in cultivation for maybe 5,000 years. We don't really know, of course, but I suspect that the dominance of the disease-resistant traits in tomatoes probably has something to do with the length of time that it's been in cultivation and with the indigenous plant breeders who bred the tomato that we eat today. Fruit color is produced by a combination of the genes that control the flesh color and the skin colors. And in both cases, red or reddish orange are dominant traits. So if you're growing a yellow tomato or an orange tomato or a green tomato, all of those are recessive traits. Now, in terms of what's hard and what's easy, the beginner plants are things like peas, beans, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, and radishes. Now, these are all plants that mature in 1 year. They're annual plants. So you don't have to wait for a second year to grow them, as is the case with things like the members of the carrot family. Or beets, for example, which you have to wait 2 years. Your brassicas are biannuals, and so you do have to wait a little bit for them. The other thing that makes these easy to grow is that the flowers are shaped in such a way as to minimize cross-fertilization. So you're very likely to get, if you're saving peas from a pea plant that you've grown, even if you grew several other varieties nearby, the chances are that what you're saving will breed true because of, as I described, the way that that flower is closed in on itself and the plant is self-fertile. It doesn't require a buddy to fertilize it. Now, some of the references, I've got a little asterisk beside my radishes. I do think they're relatively easy to save, but they can cross. So some people say they're a seed that is better suited for more experienced seed savers. Some of the more challenging seeds are corn, cucumber. Now think about the way your corn plant is constructed. You've got hundreds of seeds essentially, and each silk on the corn connects to one seed and will fertilize that one seed, and it's wind fertilized. The pollen blows in on the wind, and consequently you have a little bit more challenge in terms of being able to get something that's going to breed true. Cucumbers, also members of the squash family, cantaloupe and so forth. As I mentioned, these are a little bit challenging because they are promiscuous. And essentially what you have to do with these ones is to hand pollinate them and then close the flower so that nobody else's pollen can get in there. And that way you can ensure that it's going to breed true, and you won't get this strange mutant squash vine like I had growing out of my side raised bed, where I had 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of fruit on one plant. Spinach seeds also have a tendency to cross, so that's another one that's a little bit more, requires a little bit more work. Now the expert ones here are largely plants that require more than 1 year's growth to produce seed, and they require separation or some kind of similar technique to prevent unwanted crosses. The separation in some cases can be quite, if you're relying on distance and you're looking at bees, honeybees as your primary pollinator, they can travel up to 4 or 5 kilometers a day. And so distancing is not necessarily going to work for you. You may actually need to do something mechanical, like close off the flower or figure out a way of protecting it so that only the pollen that you want gets in there. And as I said, all of these pretty much are biennials, which means you're going to have to wait a while for your seeds to happen. They won't flower and seed until the second year of growth. Now, I've talked primarily here about food plants because these are the ones that have commercial value, and consequently, we've done a lot of work on the genetics and on understanding how to breed them. When it comes to flowers, there's a lot of factors to consider, and frankly, your observations as a gardener are often going to be the most reliable and the best source of information, because lacking commercial value or significant commercial value, there's not a lot of research. When I was looking for recent information about the concentration in the seed market, I came across a stat from 2018, 2019. 60% of all the agricultural research money goes into researching corn. So we know an awful lot about corn. We don't know a whole lot about things like alliums, which you can see in the picture here. And this picture is to illustrate when and how we would go about harvesting seed. Now, you can see from this picture that some of these seeds are just about ready to pop out of their little casings. These are dehiscent seeds, meaning that as the seed ripens, the case opens and the seed is available. It can actually fall to the ground. So this is the kind of plant that you want to stay on top of. If you're collecting those allium seeds, you might want to be out there every day shaking a few of those ripe seeds into a little jar and making sure that they're nice and dry before you store them. Because there's a whole bunch of more seeds here that aren't yet ripe. You want to pick a sunny afternoon for your seed gathering after the dew has dried, so definitely not in the morning, and after a dry spell. The day after a heavy rain is not a good day to harvest seeds, even if you're doing it late in the afternoon. And as I said, depending on the nature of what you're harvesting, something like this allium plant, you're going to be going back to visit that repeatedly to harvest the seed as it ripens and make sure that it's not falling to the ground and being lost to you as the seed saver.
Okay, Rebecca, we've got a couple of questions. Would it be convenient to take them?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, then. So have one question. What is green shoulders? And I think that was to do with the tomato plants.
Yes, it was. So the shoulders of the tomato plant are on either side of the stem. And with some varieties of tomatoes, you will find that the shoulders, for whatever reason, they're usually closest to the sun. They usually get the most amount of sun, but they're going to stay green. And that's often a characteristic you find with the so-called purple or black tomatoes, that you will have a darker colored shoulder to the fruit. It can also mean that the fruit is ripening unevenly, so that green shoulder trait is not necessarily one that you want. I see here there's one, a question about CD Saturday. It's not CDS in compact disc. It's CD as in lots of seeds. CD Saturdays are held usually in the late winter. Traditionally, the Ottawa CD Saturday was held at the Ron Colbus Lakeside Gardens on the first Saturday in March. Now, it's been a couple of years since it was last held there, largely because of COVID. And Greta, I'm blanking on Greta's last name, Greta's Organic Gardens used to be the organizer, and Greta, of course, has just very recently retired. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in future years. I know that some communities over the last couple of years we're holding virtual Seedy Saturdays. I actually talked at one that was being held in southwestern Ontario, and it seemed to be a really vibrant and fun event. But I'll tell you about the Seeds of Diversity website, where you can find out about the Seedy Saturday events as they come online. We may not yet know where the Ottawa one's going to be for next year, but over the next few months, I'm sure something will happen. Next question, is it possible to save and plant butternut seeds? Yes and yes. Saving them long-term is a real challenge, as I indicated. The butternut is in the same family as the Juglans. So it's a relative of heartnut or walnut. And as with both of those nuts, when it first falls off the tree, the nut itself is encased in a hard green shell. In order to eat the nut, you have to remove that shell rather promptly. And then inside the shell, the hard shell for the butternut seed is actually quite spiky. And the seed itself is about the size of a hazelnut typically, and very oily. And one of the challenges that Canadian foresters have had is that the oils will go rancid very quickly. So we have not yet figured out how to store butternut seeds long term. Germination is a challenge. As with many hardy perennial plants, it will need a chill period. It'll need a period of cold striation. You know, if you've ever tried to grow a walnut from seed, it can be quite challenging. It is doable, but it's not easy to do. Let me see. Particular annual varieties that self-seed and overwinter well in the soil in our regional climate. Yeah, so I kind of feel like my garden has been so densely planted for so long that it's got huge seed memory. I turn over the soil and I get something that, you know, I grew 10 years ago, for example. I recently transplanted a little evergreen shrub from one bed to another. And the next year, I had some Jimson weed growing up right next to where I had transplanted that shrub. I haven't grown Jimson weed for probably a decade or more, but those little hard seeds were in the soil. And as I turned the soil over, they came close enough to the surface to germinate. The ones that I notice most in my garden that do well wintering over, the poppies, I don't bother to collect seed from them unless it's one of those unusual genetic expressions. And they will fall to the ground and reseed themselves very easily. One of my favorite vegetables is a spinach relative called Orach, O-R-A-C-H. And it has a little round paper shell on its seed, and that makes it a real pain to collect. And it doesn't start very well indoors, but by golly, if I just scatter those little papery encased seeds all over the garden, they'll come back beautifully the next year. So that's what I usually do with those ones. Pot marigolds, yes. Regular marigolds, not so much. They don't seem to overwinter quite so well. Cosmos, both the pink ones and the orange ones, overwinter very nicely. Zinnias, I'd say that's not quite so successful. I've had some nasturtiums that will sort of spontaneously self-seed the next year. I hope that's kind of my experience. It's not something I've made a real study of, but that hopefully will give you some ideas. I hope I've answered that question to people's satisfaction. I'm getting a thank you, so I guess that's good. All right, so moving on. Now, there's two terms I'm going to introduce you here, and I've already mentioned one of them. I always get these confused, and I finally came up with a mnemonic. So there's indehiscent varieties of seeds and there's dehiscent varieties. And I think of indecent and decent. So the indecent ones, and this is where I kind of have to twist my brain. They're indecent, but the pods don't open when they're ripe. So they're not spreading themselves all over the place. So they're the opposite of indecent, if they're indehiscent. If that makes any sense. The dehiscent varieties are the ones like the poppies, or if you've ever had Himalayan balsam in your garden. I know it's a horrible invasive, but the bees love it. And sometimes I don't get around to ripping it out until it starts to flower. And then the next thing you know, it's setting seeds. And when those seeds are ripe, if you just touch them, they go spring and they scatter all over the place, which tells you something about why the Himalayan balsam plant can be so invasive. So that's one where literally when the seeds are ready to be sown or ready to be collected, the plant will do its own sowing. It just goes, scatters them all over the place in a very indecent variety, but it's dehiscent. Fleshy fruits like tomatoes and squash. Now these ones, you're going to let them ripen on the vine to the point where they're really beyond the point where you would normally pick them to eat them. So they're overly ripe. And both tomatoes and squash, melons, things of that kind, the seeds are encased in a bit of jelly, bit of sort of squishy, fibrous, gooey stuff. And you need to take that squishy, fibrous, gooey stuff off. Now, you've probably seen videos on YouTube about how to ferment your tomato seeds, and you wash them, to get the jelly off, and then you let them go a little bit moldy and you wash them again and so forth. You can do that, but honestly, for the quantity of seed that most of us are going to be saving, the easiest way to do it is to take your tomatoes or your squash or your cucumbers or whatever, and you just spread them on a paper towel, and you kind of mechanically scrape that jelly off. And as they dry on the paper towel, you can then lift them off and put them into storage. Larger seeds like beans and peas, you definitely want them to ripen on the pod. In other words, you're going to let that pod really get dried out to the point where you would never want to eat those peas or beans in the pod. The pod is all crisp and dried out. And at that point, it's ready to collect. So with those ones that we call the dehiscent varieties, where the seed is starting to open as it ripens, or the pod is starting to open as the seed ripens, the best way to collect those is in a paper bag. So you can actually fasten a paper bag around the top of the seed pod and allow it to ripen a little bit, or you can take the whole plant and fasten your paper bag around the seed head, take the whole plant and hang it upside down, and the seeds will fall into the paper bag. And that technique works very well for members of the mint family, for example. We have little teeny tiny seeds like the ones you can see in this lower illustration, the poppy seeds that I mentioned, and the lettuce seeds, which have a seed head that looks a little bit like a teeny tiny dandelion. It's got that little fluffy bit. And of course, you don't want the wind to catch that and blow it away. For anything that's maturing late or matures over a period of time, the hanging technique, in other words, hanging the whole plant upside down with a bag over the seed head, works very well as well. Now, dryness is absolutely critical. And to make sure your seeds are dry, you want to do a couple of things. Obviously, the collection time matters. You pick a dry day, afternoon, after the dew has dried. You want to remove as much of the plant material as possible, because the plant material, the little bits of plant stuff that grow in between the seeds, or the casing, the pod that holds the seeds, all of that stuff is not necessary for you to save your seeds, and it can harbor moisture and mold that can damage the seeds. So you need to remove any chaff and unneeded plant materials. And you can do this in the first picture here. We've got a colander. I found that actually works really quite well for cleaning poppy seeds, for example, because the seeds are small enough that they'll fit through the small holes in the sieve, leaving just the chaff behind. There's also this technique that you can use with larger seeds, where you pour the seeds and the chaff gently from one container to another. And if you do this on a day with a light breeze, sometimes I'll just hold a handful of seeds in my hand and blow gently, and the chaff will blow off. If you're collecting pea and bean seeds, be aware that you can get little weevils and little mites. Some of them are microscopic. Some of them have genetically evolved so that they actually look an awful lot like your seed. So if you look at your seeds carefully, you may not even see them, but with peas and beans in particular, once you have collected them and dried them, put them in the freezer for 24 to 48 hours, and that will kill any weevils. Some sources also recommend dusting your seeds with diatomaceous earth. It's not a product that I particularly like to use, but that can also be helpful in terms of eliminating pests that might attack your seeds. There's nothing more frustrating than having carefully saved your seeds, stored them away, you've dried them, you've stored them in your seed fridge or in your, in your crisper drawer or whatever in a Ziploc baggie. And you go to pull them out in the spring and you don't have seeds, you've got a handful of dust because somebody ate them over the winter. By the way, there's a really cool test that you can do for dryness. And that is that you put your seeds into a glass jar, seal the jar, and put it in the sun for an hour or so. If you see condensate forming on the inside of the jar, your seeds are not yet dry enough. And you need to put them out on a screen or someplace like that to allow them to dry further. It's important to have clean, dry containers. I use Ziploc baggies, I use glass jars, the little medicine bottles that generic drugs come in that have, usually it's a green or yellow plastic. So it's protecting them a little bit from sunlight, and then you've got a nice tight seal on it. That works very well. You can use wax paper and make your own little pouches, or you can use envelopes. You can buy little small envelopes that work very well for seed saving. And all of these are good techniques or good containers for storing seed. The airtight ones are particularly important if you're storing your seeds in the fridge, because the humidity level in the fridge is really higher than what you would ideally want. And that segues nicely into ideal storage conditions. Now, it's very difficult to get that ideal storage conditions, but ideally we want an average humidity of 25 to 35%. This is pretty dry. This is the kind of humidity level in the winter when you're walking across a carpet in your sock feet and you get a shock when you touch the door handle. So it's not particularly comfortable for human beings at this humidity level. Even in your refrigerator, although you're going to get around the right temperature of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius or about 42 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about what you get in your fridge. But your humidity level in your fridge is going to be closer to 70 or 90%. So that's why I say if you are storing your seeds in your fridge, and some people have a beer fridge in the basement. I have a little mini seed fridge in the basement. So that's where I store mine because it's dark, the temperature is correct, and I simply ensure that everything is dry and in an airtight container going into the fridge. Long-term storage minus 18 degrees Celsius or about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you've heard about the Svalbard seed vault in Norway, I think it is. I think it's Norway. It's actually an island somewhere in the North Sea. And it was engineered to have this low level of humidity and low temperature for long-term storage. It's called the Doomsday Seed Vault of food plants, seeds for food plants. Unfortunately, as a result of climate change, they had flooding there this spring, so that's not ideal by any means. Not sure if we're going to be rebuilding our seed vault somewhere drier and higher above sea level. It's best to store your seeds in the dark, and that's another advantage of my little seed fridge. Once the door is closed, the light goes out. Cold cellars also can be good, but sunlight can lead to photodegradation, which will actually result in the seeds not keeping us well and losing some of the germplasm, which will allow the seedling to germinate. So as I said, fridge storage requires airtight containers. If you have a cold cellar, particularly if you have a cold cellar in an older home, make sure that you have a rodent-proof container, so glass or metal. Your Ziploc baggies are likely not going to do the job for you. Now, online, you can find lots of different charts for seed viability. Keep in mind that all of the information you read online about how long a seed can last is based on this idea of ideal storage conditions. So, you know, I know one of my friends used to keep her seeds in a cupboard above the stove. And of course, every time the stove went on, things got nice and warm and toasty. And it was the insulation behind the cupboard wasn't all that good. So got cold in the winter, got hot in the summer, the humidity levels fluctuated. This was definitely not ideal storage conditions. The rule of thumb that I've got here, the larger the seed, the longer it will live, except that isn't always true. There are some things I've found over the years simply do not keep well. For example, parsnips. Parsnips, you pretty much have to have seeds that are fresh. Verbena bonariensis, I have never been able to germinate that from 2-year-old seeds. It's got to be fresh seed. The ricin, the castor bean plant that I mentioned at the outset, that's another one, big oily seed. Because it's a big seed, you'd think, well, it's got lots of germplasm in it. It should last, but no, the oils go rancid and that seed does not keep well. Typically, if it's a hard-shelled seed, it's going to last better. I mentioned the Jimson weed that popped out of the ground and germinated after 10 years of living underground somewhere. That's an example of a really hard-shelled seed, and clearly it survived very, very nicely in the ground for a decade or so. And as I said, you can get information like this online relatively easily. It's not that hard to find, and it's usually going to be fairly reliable. I would say 5 years is probably the best that I've done with tomato seeds. I have gotten germination from older seeds. Typically, your germination rate will fall off somewhat dramatically after this, though. So when you buy a pack of seeds, usually you can count on, I would say, about 85 to 90% germination. So you have a package of 100 seeds, 80 to 90 of them should germinate and turn into plants. But as your seeds age, of course, they're not going to germinate at quite the same rate. So 4 or 5 year old tomato seeds, you might only get 50% germination. And finally, we'll end up with a few resources. So the International Seed Saving Institute has some great how-tos on saving seeds from vegetables. Seeds of Diversity. This is an absolutely wonderful organization. You can get annual membership for, I think it's around $20 or so. It's not that expensive. Totally worth supporting. These are the guys that advertise Seedy Saturdays every year. And they also, for their members, they have an online searchable database. And just to give you an idea of how good this is, my darling sister-in-law in Toronto was born in South Africa. And she emailed me a few years ago and said, Rebecca, I really would love to grow these gem squash that we used to grow in South Africa when I was a girl. And I thought to myself, well, good luck with that. You know, Canada's a long way from South Africa. You know, if you were growing gem squash 30, 40 years ago when you were a girl in South Africa, what are the odds I'm going to be able to find the seed here? So with very little hope of success, I consulted the searchable database for Seeds of Diversity. Lo and behold, I found 2 Canadian seed vendors who sold gem squash. One of them right here in Ottawa. In fact, it was our friend Greta from Greta's Organic Seeds. And so I was able to go pick up a package of seeds and mail them to my sister-in-law. And she was able to grow her gem squash. And it actually was exactly the squash that she remembered from her childhood. So that to me speaks volumes to the diversity that's available through Seeds of Diversity. And as I said, it's also a site that's well worth keeping an eye on to find out when the Seedy Saturday is going to be in Ottawa next year and where it's going to be. By the way, we've had, for those who are comfortable in Canada's second official language, the city of Gatineau has had a Foire des Semences on several occasions. It doesn't seem to be a regular event. It's a little hard to track down information about it, but I really enjoyed going to it because it was a whole different set of vendors and different kinds of seeds that I hadn't seen on the Ontario side. Canadian Organic Growers promotes open pollinated seeds. Their national office is here in Ottawa, and they have an excellent lending library. The Ottawa Valley Rock Garden and Horticultural Society has an annual seed exchange, and their seed exchange is part of a larger international network. So that's a wonderful way to obtain rare and unusual plants, and of course, particularly rock garden plants. And the North American Rock Garden Society has a publication called Seed Exchange News, and lots of fascinating information on how to germinate these unusual and often really tricky varieties. I see we have another question on there. What is the name of the Gatineau? It's an event rather than an organization. It's Foire, or so the foyer, or the Foire is festival, I guess. I'm not sure. Foire des Semences is the name. Foire is the first word. Des, D-E-S, Semences, S-E-M-E-N-E-C-E-S. I think I spelled that right. Anyway. Foire. Let me try. It's F-O-I-R-E-S. Foire des Semences. Not Fleur des Semences. And that concludes my presentation. So I'd be more than happy to take any other questions you might have. Oh, we've got a couple more. Yeah, the Gatineau Seed Festival, Foire des Semences. I'm going to put that in the chat so everybody can read it. And as I said, it isn't every year. I have been able to track it down occasionally through Facebook or something like that. And Seeds of Diversity does have a French language side, so you might be able to find it there as well. But Seedy Saturday events have become very popular. They have them in Almont, Perth, Cornwall, all up and down the Ottawa Valley. So if you happen to miss the one in Ottawa, I kind of lucked in 2020 because I went to the Almont Seedy Saturday in February and actually had bought a bunch of seeds there. And then when the Ottawa Seedy Saturday came around, the first Saturday in March, poor Greta, she must have thought she was cursed because there was a region, like a neighborhood power outage that affected the whole of West Ottawa, including the Ron Colba Center. So the event ended up being canceled for that weekend. It was rescheduled for 2 weeks later, and that was the first weekend of COVID lockdown. So we haven't had a Seedy Saturday in Ottawa for two years running now. But if that does happen again next year, consult the Seeds of Diversity website. You might find that you are able to find the seeds you're looking for through one of their vendors. Or you might find that there is an in-person Seedy Saturday event. If not in Ottawa, then one of the neighboring small towns. Any more questions? Well, I'll just end then with the Master Gardeners information. And
Sorry, there is just one last question.
oh, there is one last question. Baptisia seed pods appear to be indehiscent. Is this correct? Do you know, I grew a Baptisia australis from seed at least a decade ago, and the darn thing has never flowered for me. So I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. I don't think they pop open. One of the illustration or one of the photos I took for the Oscar article was actually one half of a Caragena seed pod. And those Caragena, the Siberian pea shrub, it has pods that look a little bit like a pea pod. And as they ripen, one half will twist one way and the other half will twist the other way. And again, they scatter the seeds. And I can remember sitting in my backyard on days when I had, nice sunny afternoon in usually would have been, I guess, late June, early July. It was a very quiet day. And every once in a while you'd hear, and it was these seed pods cracking open and flinging their seeds out into the world. Baptisia, I don't know. As I say, mine has never flowered for me. I just transplanted it this year to someplace where I hope it will get a little bit more sun and be happier and actually produce flowers. But if the seed pods do not open on their own, then yes, it is an indehiscent plant.
Okay, so just one from Marilyn about hens and chicks. Can you see it?
Let's see.
What's going on here?
Is that for, no, I can't see that one. Could you read that out to me?
Should be there.
Oh, here we go. Been growing hens and chicks, wondering if I can shake the flowers and get the seeds or how else they can be collected and spread. Well, that's a really interesting question. I can remember visiting a member of the Rock Garden Society, and they had what they called a scent spiral. Now, hens and chicks to me look pretty much the same. This particular couple was growing about 20 different varieties, if not more, in this sort of raised rock garden bed. So there are presumably different varieties. I don't know if they've been hybridized or not. You can certainly try. And I would encourage all of you, as I said, we really don't know a lot about ornamental plants because their commercial value is limited. So as gardeners, we have an opportunity to investigate. Hens and chicks, or sempervivums, as they're also called, are one of the favorite plants of the rock garden crew. And that NARGS reference, the North American Rock Garden Society, is probably a really good place to look for information about how to propagate them other than vegetatively. So again, my apologies, that's not a plant that I have grown. And I don't know the answer as to whether or not you can shake the flowers and get the seeds or not. Obviously, you need to wait for the flowers to die back and for the seeds to form before you tried to collect seed. But the Rock Garden, North American Rock Garden Society is probably an excellent resource for finding the answer to that question. And when in doubt, give it a go. You know, the worst thing that happens is you devote a tiny little bit of fridge space to something that's not going to germinate, but maybe it will, who knows? Saving seeds and growing them on is one of the more fun things that you can do in the garden. And boy, you get some great bragging rights from it too.
Okay, there was just a note there from Nicole to everybody, which we can all read. Okay, so you were just going to help us with the where to find further information.
Yep, so this is the resource page here.
Yeah.
And as I said, for your question about the hens and chicks, I think the North American Rock Garden Society would be a great resource for you. Oh, peony seeds. Well, now, I'm going to give the Ottawa Valley Rock Garden and Horticultural Society a bit of a plug. And there is also a peony society in Ottawa. The answer to your question is it's not that difficult. Marilyn Light, who is going to be the speaker for the Rock Garden Society this coming Saturday, will be talking about a number of her seed starting experiments. And I know for a fact that Marilyn has germinated the wild strain of peony, which is commonly called Molly the Witch. And that's a really easy one. However, be aware there's a lot of hybridization in the peony market. So you're very likely to hit a plant where if you're collecting seeds from a peony that you really like in your garden, it's most likely a hybridized one, and what you get will quite possibly not breed true.
Okay, are there any more questions? Well, if not, I think my opportunity, Rebecca, to thank you for a quite intriguing presentation. You've challenged us all to acts of rebellion, and we will take you up on that. So anyway, again, thank you very much for the presentation.
My pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful evening and lots of fun over the winter thinking about the seeds that you can collect. It's not too late, by the way. Now is actually a great time. I've collected seeds right through, even after we've had several hard frosts. Mm-hmm. That also can be a good time to collect seeds. So have fun with it. And yeah, let's keep the revolution going. Bye for now, everybody.
Okay then. Thanks again.